we're talking with Thomas Mann and Norm Ornstein about their book, It's Even Worse Than It Looks, which is about dysfunctional government in Washington, particularly the extremism of the Republican Party and how the party has evolved in such an extreme fashion. It has made governance extremely difficult, if not impossible, in Washington. I just want to give a little empirical grounding to this, because there's one of these. This is one of these arguments you can have that can begin to sound very abstract about who's more extreme than whom. Politicians have actually come up, political scientists Keith Poole and Howard Rosenthal have come up with this now somewhat famous index called the DW Nominate Score, which is a way of analyzing where parties are in their ideological extremism. And here's a graph showing House polarization 1879 to 2011, and what you see is a real that upwards tick of the 90% Republican and 10% Republican, which are the ends of the party, they shoot up much faster than the bottom two lines, which means they're veering off to the right much faster than the Democrats are veering off to the left. And the same thing more or less for the Senate, if we can just show that up, although that's a little messier. But if you look at the DW Nominate scores, you know there is some empirical grounding here. Exactly. But we were talking about what the causal story of it is, and you say they've become implacably opposed to the political opposition they face. But I don't understand why that's different than somebody. You say, well, it used to be about problem solving. Or why was it about problem solving before? Well, why were there a certain set of cultural norms that pertained in Washington before, and now those norms are different?
It's a combination of things. You know, partly there were, prior to this polarization, a number of Republicans who were outside of that zeitgeist who wanted to legislate. But over time, they came to leave the party, and the center of gravity in the party became vehemently ideological and oppositional. And then the backdrop to this in the broader society with the new media really came to support a whole new set of norms that said we are engaged in a holy war.
But why are the... Yeah, Michelle.
I'm sitting back and not as a political scientist, just as your average citizen watching all of this, and I look at the differences between how Republicans and Democrats interact with one another, with a Democrat sitting in the White House. And Republicans hated Bill Clinton, but he was able to get welfare reform passed. He was able to get NAFTA passed. And so you sit back and you have to ask yourself, well, what's different now? We've got Barack Obama in office, and all of a sudden, the polarization to me seems to be even worse. The anger, the statements of we want to take our country back. And there's a part of me that has to ask, do you feel, in doing the research for the book, that any of this has... in any way whatsoever has to do with the fact there are a lot of people on the right who are frankly just angry that the President of the United States is a black man and are willing to basically destroy the country from a legislative perspective just to make sure that not only does he not win, but the Democrats don't win. I mean, we've got pushback on passing the Violence Against Women Act, pushback on so many different legislative things that you would think would be a no-brainer.
Let me say,
how big is the racial component of the story?
You know, race is never far from the surface in American politics, but if you look back at some of the things written and said about Bill Clinton in 1993 and 94, I mean, I remember Wall Street Journal editorials that placed him close to being an accessory to murder when he was governor of Arkansas. And it's true that in 96 we got cooperation, but in 94 and 95 we had total opposition, unanimous opposition to everything. It worked in the 94 elections. Then we got the shutdown of the government. Newt saw that that was going to lead to disaster for Republicans in Congress and cooperated through a year and a half, and then of course we led to impeachment. And I think, you know, if we're looking at causes of this, Newt is a major part, and part of it's understandable.
A pioneer.
Well, the fact is, when Republicans were problem solving, they were in the minority, and that was for 40 consecutive years. Newt saw the way to move it to a majority. It took him 16 years, but he got it. And now we're in an era of party competition where anybody can win. You put that together with the demise of moderate Republicans and the stakes being much higher, and all of this is a toxic stew, and race into it.
Let me just make quickly the point that part of what the in terms of where race never being far from the surface of the story. Of course, the thing that made moderate Republicans and conservative Democrats was the scrambling of essentially the country working through the politics of Reconstruction and the Civil War for 100 years after it happened, 120, 140 years after it happened, right? So we had this historical accident in terms of partisan affiliation that created Northeastern moderate Republicans, it created conservative Southern Democrats. That sorting process essentially worked itself out, so you don't have this crossing anymore. But that crossing, which people kind of pine for, was just happened to be a historical accident about which party essentially occupied the South during Reconstruction, and there's no justification for it, and it's also hard to see how we go back to that, right? I mean, that was a historical accident. We can't reconstitute the strange partisan affiliations of geography that were borne out by the Civil War.
No, you can't. I agree with that, but I think you also have to look at this from the angle of, it's not just the Republican conservatives who kind of found their teeth and they're bearing them now, on policy and other issues, but you also look at the impact within the Democratic Party as well. I mean, you've got the blue dog Democrats. As much as we pine for moderate Republicans, oh my God, where are they? Well, where is that conservative voice, that moderate voice within the Democratic Party? And to the point about Barack Obama, absolutely, race is not just beneath the surface, it's on the surface, okay? That's number one, for both parties, quite frankly. Number two, I think the reality of it is, with Barack Obama versus a Bill Clinton, you have much more of an ideological split. Bill Clinton, for whatever you want to say about him, was a good old boy. He was a homeboy. He had conservatism in him to a degree that people felt comfortable to do with someone logically.
Let's correct the record here for a second. You say that now, but that was not what Republicans were saying about Bill Clinton.
That.
They were calling him a socialist, draft-dodging, pot-smoking.
I got that. But let me finish my point, then I'll be quiet. Okay. But I got that. You're absolutely right. But to the point you made, Bill Clinton did something that hasn't happened yet, and that is found those pieces of legislation where a Newt Gingrich and he could work together. Just like Reagan had Tip O'Neill, Clinton had Newt. Who does Obama have? It's a very different environment.
Thomas, I want you are shaking your head vigorously because you think this is incredible.
No,
this is totally theoretically and historically invalid, and I want you to explain why after the break.